According to the social constructivist theory, learners with different skills and backgrounds should collaborate in tasks and discussions to come to a shared understanding. Elements of the social constructivist theory, specifically Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and scaffolding, were at play throughout this unit. According to Vygotsky, if a child follows an adult's or more experienced peer's example, the child will eventually be able to do tasks without help that they previously could not do. Providing modeling and scaffolding assists learners in moving to their zone of proximal development. A student's zone of proximal development is what they can do with help versus what they are unable to do without help. In this lesson, I carefully scaffold and model skills as they are introduced while providing opportunities for students to develop these skills with the help of their peers. The twist is that all of my students have a different schema which affects their level of understanding, and I must accommodate my lesson to fit the needs of each learner. This year, my first graders were introduced to book clubs and reading. None of my students came in with any prior knowledge of what a book club is or how it works. This was a difficult skill for my students to master, and on top of that, I have 8 students in my class that speak limited to no English. In order to be successful, my students needed a lot of scaffolding in order to be able to run their own book clubs. I knew I would have to model my expected behavior and give them ample opportunities for guided practice, gradually releasing more and more of the responsibility onto my students as they eventually were able to run their own book clubs. To begin, I split my students into groups based on their reading levels. Normally, I like to mix my students up. However, since my students have such a wide variety of reading levels, and it's critical that the students read a book that they can comprehend during their book club, I decided to place my students into like-level groups. Once my students were into their groups, I offered them a variety of book series within their level. As a group, they had to decide which series to read from. After all of my groups had chosen their series, it was time to begin to introduce what a book club is and how it is run. When you are using scaffolding to teach a new skill to students, the teacher must first model the expected outcome so the students know what they need to do. To begin my unit, I modeled what a book club looked like with my students. I chose a book to read aloud to the class as our whole class book club. By having a whole class book club, I was able to explicitly model the strategies that I would teach my students in the same setting that they would be working in. Since my students had no prior knowledge of book clubs, I had to start from the very beginning and model every step. Even though all of my students did not have knowledge of how a book club works, many of them did have experience reading and discussing a story with the guidance of their teacher. In my classroom, however, I have 8 English language learners whose primary language is Japanese. For many of these students, this is their first year in an American school. These students speak little English and have almost no background knowledge of the American school system. These students come in with a very different set of understandings than many students who have been in the American school system and have had an understanding of the culture. Because of this, I started out very simple by reviewing story elements, such as characters, setting, main events, and problem and solution. To model how I expected the students to use these story elements, I read a chapter or 2 from our whole class book club book and turned to my fiction story element bookmark to guide me. I modeled talking about each element while referring to the sentence stems I provided for the students to help them form their thoughts. As soon as I finished modeling, the students then had the chance to practice discussing their books the way we had just practiced as a class. Since this was still very early on in the learning process, I would move around the classroom, sitting with each group and helping them facilitate their discussion. I might ask them questions to probe their thinking or point out certain parts of the book that they could focus on. The students still needed a lot of help at this point. After my students had a chance to practice discussing the story elements, we came back together as a class. To help my students remember what they could do in a book club, we created a chart and added discussing story elements to it. Discussing story elements is a basic skill that most of my students can already do, but this is a good beginning for my ELL students who have not yet learned that skill. I wanted to begin with an easy task so my students could focus on the skill of learning to discuss a book within a book club. Next, I introduced a skill that was more challenging, asking questions. The goal was to ask important questions relevant to the part of the book being discussed. This step of the learning process required several days of me modeling a discussion and my students going off and trying it. Just like with the first time they practiced in their book clubs, I would walk from group to help facilitate discussions and ask guiding questions when necessary. We added asking questions to our book club discussion chart, along with sentence stems for students to refer to. These sentence stems helped all students express their thinking clearly, but they especially help my ELL students. It helps them frame their thoughts and requires them to only think of the most important words. Now that all of our discussion strategies have been modeled and practiced several times, I wanted students to see an example of their peers in a book club. To do this, I put students into a fishbowl. In a fishbowl exercise, the focused students and the teacher are in the middle, and the rest of the students are in a circle around the outside. I chose my highest reading group to model their discussion for the class. I wanted it to be authentic and self-guided, so I let the students choose what they wanted to discuss. I wanted the students to have an opportunity to see not only an exemplar group discussion, but to see students run out of topics to talk about or disagree about an idea. I wanted students to see how their peers worked through these issues. Problem solving is key to working with a group, and observing their peers is one of the best ways to learn. After the fishbowl activity, I had my students discuss what they noticed about the book club discussion. We talked about what the group did well and gave them constructive pointers as to what they could improve upon. Having my students, particularly my low readers and ELLs, see an example of their peers having a discussion was so meaningful that we completed several more fishbowl exercises. Now that I have gradually introduced and modeled the various ways to hold a book club discussion and my students have had the opportunity to practice multiple times with feedback, it was time to release more of the responsibility onto my students. My students were now free to choose what they wanted to discuss within their book groups. My higher readers were reading chapter books and chose to read a mystery book. Since their book is longer and they would not be able to complete it in one sitting, I worked with them to develop a reading plan. They mapped out what chapters had to be read by when, so everyone was prepared for their book club discussion. When they got together, they often discussed clues from the books that led to them solving the mystery, how characters interacted with each other, or their questions they had along the way. My lower groups read simpler books, so they may have to read 2 or 3 books from their book club series in between the times that they met with their group. I met with these groups to assist them with planning their discussion. They had cards with questions and sentence stems on them to guide their discussion. This group focused on a simpler discussion topic of finding the similarities and differences between the different books in the series and identifying the story elements. At this point in the unit, as I was releasing more responsibility onto my students, I still roamed from group to group, listening intently and taking notes on their understandings and misunderstandings. However, I no longer intervened if a group struggled. They learned the skills necessary to problem solve. Any missteps I noticed, I took note of and we discussed as a class after the lesson. Splitting my class into ability levels for this unit helped each student tremendously because they were able to receive the scaffolding they needed. My higher groups needed less scaffolding and could for the most part carry conversations on their own, while my lower groups needed much more scaffolding and other tools to aid their discussions. The gradual release of responsibility in this unit led to a greater mastery of the skill of discussing a book in depth with a book club. This is something that my students would never have been able to do without intentional modeling and guided practice. The intense scaffolding was necessary, especially since I have such a high ELL population. Not only did these students come into my classroom with no idea about what a book club is, but they also had little schema about how the American school system works. My students that have gone to school here previously have participated in many book discussions and know the general expectations for how to behave at school. My ELL students come to me with such different set of background knowledge that repeated modeling and practice is necessary.